So today we're going to talk about two, what I'm calling tough nuts, education and healthcare. But I want to just begin by taking stock of where we were before we went on the break.
Right now, if a human worker does, $50,000 worth of work in a factory, that income is taxed. If a robot comes in to do the same thing, you'd think that we'd tax the robot at a similar level. What the world wants is to take this opportunity to make all the goods and services we have today and free up labor, let us do a better job of reaching out to the elderly, having smaller class size, helping kids with special needs. All of those are things where human empathy and understanding are still very, very unique, and we still deal with an immense shortage of people to help out there. And so if you can take the labor that used to do the thing automation replaces, and both financially and training-wise and fulfillment-wise, have that person go off and do these other things, you're net ahead. But you can't just give up that income tax because that's part of how you've been funding that level of human workers. Some of it can come on the profits that are generated by the labor-saving efficiency there. Some of it can come directly in some type of robot tax. I don't think the robot companies are going to be outraged that there might be a tax. It's okay.
So that was a fairly agreeable version of tax proposal, which I'll come back to later. But this is part 5 of the course, focused on what is to be done. And the bumper sticker with apologies to Immanuel Kant was that policy without politics is empty, but politics without policy is blind. And when we talked about policy without viable politics, I gave as examples Piketty's proposal for a global wealth tax with no identified enforcement mechanisms, and his more recent proposals for a European Parliament that would engage in redistributive politics and have trumping power over the existing European structures, even though the attempt to create such a parliament had failed because of popular hostility to it and had instead resulted in the Lisbon Treaty. When we talked about politics without viable policies, I gave as the bumper sticker for that the subprime mortgage crisis, where extremely politically effective coalitions had been put together across the aisle and with lobbyists and industry advocates, not to mention advocates for housing for the poor, but it produced a train wreck of a policy. I focused on the subject of insecurity, arguing that insecurity is in many respects more important than inequality, and certainly than global inequalities for people, and made the case that universal basic income, despite the apparent support for it across various ideological groups, that doesn't withstand scrutiny when you see that the conservative case for it would largely result in the abolition of what we think of as the welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, and so on. So there would easily be blocking coalitions for that. And indeed, when you look in Europe at where they've held referendums on this, such as in Switzerland, there's not much support for it. We talked some about minimum wage and the difficulties of that, particularly the race to the bottom or the race out of the country problem that accompanies minimum wage politics, and instead argued for an expanded earned income tax credit, which goes back to the Nixon administration's notion of a negative income tax and could become the basis for a more effective wage subsidy, and has been greatly expanded in recent decades under Republican and Democrat administrations. And there are also state-based earned income tax credits, which have the advantage of creating a kind of race to the top incentive in that they become magnets. States can make themselves magnets for employment because of the employment subsidy. Economists will still complain that this distorts labor markets, which it does, but any policy that attempts to affect employment at some level is going to affect labor markets, and we argue that this is a better way to do it. We then went on to the idea of universal adjustment assistance, and I worked through the sort of tragic history of trade adjustment insurance, adjustment assistance, where labor had initially supported it as a quid pro quo for the 1962 Trade Act, which reduced tariffs, but then it was largely not implemented by the Johnson administration that came into office in 1963. Nothing was paid out, in fact, over the next decade, and by the time business got around to supporting it, labor had bailed out, and it had garnered a lot of opposition because by only supporting people who lose their jobs from trade, this seemed arbitrary from the point of view of people who lost their jobs for other reasons. And indeed, when the Reagan administration effectively killed off the program, they made that same argument. So it was made both on the left and the right. And we argue, particularly given the sort of dynamic that Bill Gates is referring to, their jobs growing in any case increasingly to technology rather than to trade, there should be a Danish-style, much more universal system of adjustment assistance that would provide for relocation, for retraining across a lifetime. And when we think about how might that sort of adjustment assistance be funded, as Gates perhaps is a little naive to think corporations will not abolish it, but in fact this is in the interest of business, because one thing that economists will say, but is not obvious to lay people, is that public education of any sort is actually a subsidy to business. It's a government subsidy to business by creating trained workers that businesses can then hire. And so government subsidies of retraining programs, again, is at the end of the day a subsidy to business. And we make the case in my forthcoming book with Michael Gratz that business leaders should be getting behind doing what Gates is doing there, getting behind such proposals, because they will, it's sort of, if you like, Tocqueville's self-interest rightly understood. It really is in business's interest to support the creation of a perpetually re-educable workforce that's going to be flexible in the ways that are going to be required by the demands of the 21st century. So today's agenda is to talk about two other challenges, K through 12 education and universal health insurance. And they're very vexed subjects in America, and they're vexed subjects partly because there are two other features of the American political order which make it extremely difficult to enact a lot of social policies, and these are worse here, or more challenging here, than in many other countries. The first is fiscal federalism. We've referred to this earlier in the course, you might recall, when I talked about the deinstitutionalization of psychiatric patients in connection with rising prison populations, and that with the discovery of antidepressants and psychotropic drugs to repress things like schizophrenia, when in the 1960s and 70s, this led to many people who had previously lived in their whole lives in psychiatric hospitals to be released. But it was also a time of great fiscal crisis in many of the states, and so those savings were put to the bottom line of state budgets, and instead those people wound up in America's cities where there were no resources for them, and consequently many of them then wound up back in the prison system. And so this is the kind of the dark side of fiscal federalism, that we have a very decentralized federal system, unlike, say, the German federal system, where there are very clear demarcations because the whole federal system was designed at once of so there are clear demarcations of what is the responsibility of which level of government, whereas we have a kind of bottom-up federalism that was created piecemeal, and powers not explicitly delegated to the federal government reside with the states. Some things are the province of cities and not the responsibilities of states, and so it's very easy for things to fall through the cracks. And we will see as we talk about education and healthcare that this decentralized character of American federalism makes it extremely difficult to enact policies that in other countries would be done as a matter of national policy, or what we would call federal policy here. The other is that the American system is much more subject to what some social scientists refer to as path dependence. And the idea of path dependence is, as the name implies, as you start heading down one path, and maybe you take a left fork, then you're confronted with some other forks, but you no longer have the option of the right fork you would have taken, perhaps if you'd seen later on what were the consequences of going on the left fork. And so this is the idea of path dependence. Things that are done earlier shape the choices of things that are coming later. Now, if you have a very centralized political system, that may not matter very much. So say in Britain, where they have strong parties, I'll talk more about that on Thursday, they can do things like nationalize and denationalize and renationalize British Rail. It's relatively simple because most political power resides in the House of Commons. So they can make decisions that are decisive, and they can if the incentives change or new information arises, they can make a different policy. Our system is designed to be extremely difficult to change. And so there are multiple veto players in the system, as we've discussed in earlier classes, with the bicameralism, with the separation of powers, with the presidentialism, with the federalism, with the Senate filibuster rules, and with the overrepresentation of small states in the Senate, with the court. All of these veto players mean that the choices made, once they're embedded, are very difficult to change. And we talked about this in connection also with embedding proximate goals, that you want to make your proximate goals difficult to change. And so FDR, in the case of Social Security, found a way to use the inertia in the system to protect Social Security. But the inertia is there, and it means that path dependence is a much bigger deal in the US system than in other systems. And so as we go through these two examples of K-12 education and healthcare, you're going to see the fiscal federalism and the inertia that privileges path dependent popping up again and again and again, and creating substantially bigger challenges for these sorts of policies in the US than we see elsewhere. So I asked you to read the Dale Russakoff's The Prize about New Jersey educational reform, and let's just get our minds around that with this look at this video.
Republican Governor Chris Christie, Democratic Mayor of Newark Cory Booker, and the founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, are putting politics aside to help turn around the failing public schools in Newark, New Jersey. This is the first time all three of you have really come together to talk about this big idea. So, Mayor Booker, for those who don't know, what's the big news?
Well, we've been talking for quite some time about creating a bold new paradigm for educational excellence in the country to show the way, to put the people of the city of Newark really in the driver's seat and the focal point, and to work to get all the assets and resources we need to give to them to succeed.
So, Governor Christie, what are you committing to? What are you committing to?
What I'm committing to is changing the schools in the city where I was born and spent the first years of my life. And Mayor Booker is going to be the point person, our lead guy in Newark, in helping to develop this entirely new plan of how to reform the education system in Newark and create a national model. I'm empowering him to do that. I'm in charge of the public schools in the city of Newark as governor. And I'm going to empower Mayor Booker to develop that plan and to implement it with a superintendent of schools that we're going to pick together.
I think that is so fantastic. I think that is so fantastic. In this age of red states and blue states and everybody being so partisan about everything, the fact that you all would come together, did that ever enter into it, the politics, that you're a Republican and he's a Democrat?
No, it's about the children. I mean, you go to Newark. Go to Newark and you watch, as you saw in the movie, and there's other movies that display this, about parents and children sitting in a gymnasium waiting to see if their number gets picked out of a barrel and watching parents sob. And I met a woman who got her son into one of the best charter schools in Newark, the Robert Treat Academy, and her son was now in the 3rd grade at that point. And I said, what was it like the night you got him in? And she said, when I was waiting in that gym, I knew that whether his number got picked out was the difference between him going to college or going to jail. No mother in America should have to sit there and by chance decide that. And when I heard that, that's when I was U.S. Attorney. When I heard that story, that turned my entire attitude towards putting this first. And he feels that way too. And now we've got another partner with us to make it happen.
If we as a nation keep pulling left and right, we will never move forward. And
Right.
yes.
Right. We'll be doing this.
Right. And most of us understand that.
Yes.
Most of us understand that.
So, Mr. Zuckerberg, what role are you playing in all of this? Are the rumors true? Will there be a check offered at some point? Yes.
Well, yeah, I've committed to starting the Startup Education Foundation, whose first project will be a $100 million challenge grant.
$100 million.
$100 million.
Yo. Okay, why education and why Newark?
Why education? Because every child deserves a good education, and right now that's not happening. I've had a lot of opportunities in my life, and a lot of that comes from having gone to really good schools, and I just want to do what I can to make sure that everyone has those same opportunities.
And why Newark, though? Because, what's your relationship with Newark?
Well, Newark is really just because I believe in these guys, right? As running a company, the main thing that I have to do is find people who are going to be really great leaders and invest in them. And that's what we're doing here. We're setting up a $100 million challenge grant so that Mayor Booker and Governor Christie can have the flexibility that they need to implement new programs in Newark and really make a difference and turn Newark into a symbol of educational excellence for the whole nation.
So that is not a good way to make social policy. It was a predictable train wreck, and I asked you to read it for 2 reasons. One is the brilliant depiction of the extent of the problem in Newark. It is very, we live increasingly in a segmented worlds where we call it, we talked about soft apartheid earlier, but it's difficult to overstate the devastated neighborhoods in the school system, which had been it had been taken over by the state some years before. The dropout rates and failure rates that she describes are just mind-blowing. So it is a very sobering description of the extent of the problem of public education in America's inner cities. And I think Newark is certainly, in that respect, quite typical. But I also wanted to have you read it because it is so clearly designed to, if it had been designed to fail, this is how one would have designed it. It wasn't actually 100 million, it was 200 million because it was a challenge grant and other foundations put up additional money. And there were a variety of reasons that it was almost destined to fail. One was the top-down and Band-Aid quality of the whole effort. It was later revealed huge amounts of money were wasted on consultants who paid themselves to write long reports. There was almost no buy-in from the parents of the children in the schools concerned, and the neighborhood-based funding model resists this kind of injection. $200 million sounds like a lot of money. The Newark schools budget, of course, is billions and billions. So at most, these could be some kind of demonstration projects. We're not going to have a big impact. Very little of the money went into classrooms. Much of it went into administrative reform. And the other thing that they did was they brought in a school superintendent, who we'll hear more from, who was confronted with the difficulty that by creating impetus to increase charter schools, which are schools that are funded with taxpayer money but not subject to the same kinds of regulation, the issue becomes twofold. One, are the charter schools better, which generates a lot of controversy. Some are, some are not, and on average it's not clear that they are. But then secondly, what happens to the children who are left behind? And this is the ones who do not go into the charter schools. And so what you get is essentially an accentuation of differential options due to fewer and fewer possibilities of upward mobility. The emphasis on charter schools, Cami Anderson she had the added disadvantage that the population is overwhelmingly African American, and she was the first white school superintendent brought in. But she correctly identified this as what she called the lifeboat theory of public education. That is, you take some children out of the schools, the failing schools, and you send them to the charter schools, and it's a lifeboat for that child, but then you have to think of, if it's a good charter school, but then you have to think about what is the likely effect on the children who remain behind. This is very comparable to the school voucher movement that gained a lot of traction in the 1990s and has now actually come back, we'll see, with Betsy DeVos and the Trump administration. But so again, the notion here was that it's a Hirschman story that if you think about America's school system, first of all, we have private schools, so people who can afford private schools can leave, and that means that their relatively low exit costs mean that they don't have the incentive to stay and exercise voice to improve the system for the rest. And so like the charter schools movement, the vouchers movement, pressed by these two academics, John Chubb and Terry Moe, the idea was that the government should give vouchers to parents, and that they would create competition. First, competition within the public schools, and so the competition, if you like, would give poor people, and this was it had a populist flavor to it, poor people the capacity to move to better schools, and that would put pressure on the worst schools to improve themselves or go out of business. And so this was the public schools variant of it. And then increasingly there was pressure also to let these vouchers be used in private and parochial schools. And indeed, that was challenged in the courts because a lot of these schools were Catholic schools, religious schools. But in 2002, by a 5-4 decision, the court said it was okay, with Rehnquist, I believe, writing the majority opinion. It was okay to use taxpayer money for vouchers even if they were going to be spent in religious parochial schools, so that in effect it's violating the so-called wall of separation between church and state. So this was another way to try and diminish the costs being experienced by people in the system by introducing some kind of competition and better options for children in the public schools. But as Kemi Anderson says at one point, she says she didn't come here to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. And so basically what happened in Newark was that about 40% of the children wound up going to these newly improved charter schools chosen by lotteries, and the remaining 60% of the kids were in even more underfunded schools in the rest of the public system, which was that bred so much of the backlash. And what we have seen in the wake of the failure of that initiative is quite a substantial backlash against the school reform movement, both backlash against charters and against vouchers, both of which predictably are strongly opposed by teachers' unions, and teachers' unions turn out to be one of the few relatively potent union movements left in America. So in Newark in 2014, Ras Baraka became mayor after defeating another pro-charter candidate who went on to become president of the pro-charter Democrats for Education Reform, and he was reelected with over 77% of the vote 4 years later. In New York, this was a central plank of de Blasio's victory with 73% of the vote in 2013, a strident anti-charter campaign ushering in an era of feuding with the various proponents, and he was also reelected by a huge majority. Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, longtime former chief of staff of Barack Obama, longtime mayor of Chicago, also has run into massive backlash in Chicago over the Chicago charter schools. 2016, Hillary Clinton, who had also been a longtime advocate of charter schools, was forced to back away and reverse her longstanding support. And indeed, in January of this year, there was a huge teacher strike in Los Angeles. And it was just when the candidates were announcing, or declaring interest in running for president, and all of the wannabe Democratic candidates quickly came out in strong support of this strike, a central pillar of which was to try and stop the expansion of charter schools in Los Angeles. And Cory Booker, who you saw in that video, had actually long been an advocate of charter schools, was very quick to announce his support for that strike. So the fight over vouchers continues. In 2018, the Trump administration cut over $3.5 billion out of the Department of Education's budget, and also devoted $1 billion to be spent on private school vouchers and other school choice programs. So there's an ongoing political battle, but it's extremely difficult to see a path forward for this kind of educational reform, which tends to be piecemeal, city by city, high visibility initiative by high visibility initiative, but doesn't get at the systemic challenges of the decentralized system. By the way, efforts to get reform through the courts of the neighborhood-based funding system have also been rejected by the Supreme Court. So you can't go that route either. And it makes K through 12 education a real challenge, and you can see that it's gotten worse. This is the divergence of educational opportunity over the 40 years up to 2010. You can see, if you look at the top income quartile, the number of children getting college degrees has doubled. But if you go to the next quartile, between 50 and 75%, it's grown. It's also doubled, but to a lower number. But in the bottom two quartiles, there's basically been no expansion of educational opportunity measured as getting a college degree. So no upward mobility for the bottom half of the population, despite the increase in upward mobility for people at the top. So these local efforts largely fail. One counter example to this, by the way, is New Orleans, where after Hurricane Katrina pretty much wiped out the whole school system, they put in a system that is almost exclusively charter schools. And there are, again, contending debates about the merits of these schools. There's, I think, a general perception that they're an improvement. But that is a very unusual situation where you have your entire school system wiped out by an exogenous shock and can redesign from scratch and thereby defy some of the path dependencies that have been built into the system. Now, so this is the sort of pragmatic piecemeal solutions at the local level. We should talk a little bit about what efforts have been made at the national level, where, as in most countries, educational policy is decided. And there have been efforts. Probably the most notable one in recent decades was the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act that was put in place by the Johnson administration. And they were able to do that, first of all, because of the huge landslide that they won in the 1964 elections. And it also gave Johnson his mandate for other elements of the Great Society and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts that we have talked about. He also engaged in very clever coalition-building politics, thinking back to our lecture on building blocks. So, for example, there had long been opposition from groups, parochial groups, Catholics, and so on, for the federal government's giving money to local school districts because it wouldn't benefit Catholic students. And so he instead devised a plan where the money would actually go to the students and not to the schools. And so the argument was that the federal government was not supporting religious schools. This was before the Supreme Court had decided as it had in the voucher cases that would come later. But then secondly, civil rights advocates and advocates of minority groups had also opposed giving money to segregated schools. Because if you gave money to segregated schools, it was federal money to segregated schools, was going to reinforce probably, or so it was believed, the advantages achieved by children in predominantly white schools. With the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passing, but particularly with the Civil Rights Act passing, those urban liberal groups got turned around and now became supporters. So the Johnson administration was a pretty big policy. It was $1 billion, which would be $8 billion today, rising to $4.2 billion later in the decade, which would be $31 billion today, literally a tenfold increase on what the federal government had been spending a decade earlier. So it was a really substantial federal program. But it soon came under Republican attack by 1968. Of course, the Nixon administration had come on. It was very inefficiently administered. Much of it was spent on local school administration and not on classrooms. But also, it was basically remedial education. And they ran into the problem that Russakoff also identifies in the New Jersey schools, that essentially trying to tackle underachieving children in the classroom it's too far downstream from the causes of the problem. And so you have these programs that improve kids' performance over the summer, let's say, but over the school year, but then over the summer, they tend to, most of the benefits dissipate, and when they come back the following year, many of the parent advantages have gone away. And this had actually been identified by a sociologist some of them of Coleman in 1966, that remedial programs don't really work. And this is the same message that actually Zuckerberg took away from the failure in Newark, that if you're really going to address the problems of inner city schools, you have to start with the homes and the neighborhoods and what people are eating and where they are sleeping and whether they are sleeping, and the basic capacities that need to be developed cannot just be developed in classrooms. So that didn't go well. The next big federal effort was in the 2001 reauthorization of ESEA. This was the reauthorization of the legislation that had been passed in 1965. And this was the so-called No Child Left Behind program put in place by the George W. Bush administration. I think I got the wrong date on that. It was actually 2002. The idea here was to identify certain benchmarks that had to be met in order to get federal funding. It was largely attacked. It was roundly attacked from all sides, partly because it was seen as much too top-down, even though there were concessions like allowing each district or each state, at any rate, to identify the benchmarks that had to be met. But then this produced critiques to the effect that they were manipulating the benchmarks in order to show the results of improvement on the one hand, and that other districts which were actually achieving absolute gains but didn't meet the benchmarks weren't getting the funds. And so it was again attacked from all sides, strongly resisted by teachers' unions as teaching to the test, not providing genuine education, and the manipulation of the tests, so on. Finally, what was left of it was pretty much put out of its misery by the Obama administration in 2015, where they turned over what was left of the program to the states. So it's very difficult to see how you put together a national coalition to address K through 12 education, partly for all the reasons I've already identified. And the one final thing to say is that the coalition to demand it is not there, because at the very high end, of course, the American system is extremely good. So people in private schools, people in wealthy neighborhoods where the public schools are very good, have no real incentive in this highly decentralized, locally funded system. They have no incentive to get behind any kind of comprehensive reform. And, you know, I think I mentioned to you earlier in the course, I used to live in Guilford, Connecticut, and I watched over a course of decades as the proportion of people living in the town with children decreased because of the graying of that population of that town. It became increasingly difficult to pass the town budget because there's a lot of genteel poverty in those towns. There's a lot of resentment of school teachers who have good unions and good jobs, and so people who maybe inherited a house but can't pay the taxes on it, they show up and vote down the town budget because half of it is the schools. And so you have a big divided dollar problem. In that case, eventually the Connecticut State Supreme Court ordered the raising of the mill rate on the grounds that there's a right to an education. Connecticut state constitutional right to an education. So they limited the damage in that way. But the combination of the fiscal federalism and the Hirschman-esque problem that if you decrease exit costs, which sounds good to give people other opportunities, you increase voice costs and you make it less likely that the residual system is going to be improved. So that is the rather depressing story of K through 12 education in America. Let's talk about health insurance. And here, again, it's in many respects a depressing story that exhibits infirmities of the education system, though not as depressing as the K through 12 education story. And actually, we have a proposal that might actually work. So thinking about the healthcare system, the U.S. system is unusual in two respects for any advanced democracy. One is that there is not universal coverage, and the other is that we have these employer-based systems. Most people get their insurance through their work. 180 million Americans at least get their insurance through their work. Now you might say, well, why did we get this system? And here's a good example of the path dependency issue that I was talking about. In 1942, during World War II, the government instituted wage controls. Employers were not allowed to give pay raises. But there were also great labor shortages, and so employers were looking for ways to compete for labor, for workers. And so the following year, the War Labor Board said, well, benefits would not count as wages. And so what happened was that employers started giving out health insurance as a way of increasing the real wage they were paying to workers without violating the stricture that the wage freeze that was the case had been put in place for the duration of the war. And so this meant a massive increase by the end of the war in this employer-provided health insurance. And then, of course, once you have it, the people who have it don't want to give it up, right? And so this is a very sort of micro but poignant illustration of how the path dependency for a system can get going and then accelerate. So we don't have a universal system, partly for that reason, but there are other reasons as well. One is the employer-based system I already mentioned, but the other is Medicare. As I said to you a little while ago, that Medicare was a very major achievement in 1965, single-payer health care for people over the age of 65. The problem with doing that is that it creates a potential fissure in the coalition of people to demand universal health insurance, because the elderly now have what they need and the employed have what they need. And so those groups of people don't have much of an incentive to support the expansion, particularly if you think about the elderly, because when we look at these Democratic plans on offer from the candidates, you know, Elizabeth Warren initially costed her Medicare for All at $20 trillion. Most of the independent evaluations about are closer to double that, and even she is now being forced to walk away from that. But if you think of the available pool of resources for health insurance as finite, expanding the coverage is going to come at probably the cost of coverage for people who already have it. So this patchwork of partial provision makes it harder to generate the demand for a universal system. Unlike Britain, for example, which put in a universal system at one fell swoop for everybody in 1947 under the Attlee government. So those are among the obstacles. And then Medicaid is stigmatized as a poor person's program, and so not viewed as a desirable thing for people to want to have. And it's also caught up in fiscal federalism because it's funded with certain amounts of money that come from the federal governments to the states, but then they have to raise the difference in local taxation, and so that creates huge amounts of pressure on the states to limit what Medicaid is going to cover, because particularly in recent decades, as the federal government has reduced what it provides and has gone to systems of block grants, which again are not sensitive to changes in the populations that are actually being served. So that's another set of obstacles. And it's in this context that we have to think about the Obama legislation. And it's much pilloried and it's got many defects to it. But it's worth pausing just to note what it did in fact achieve. Given the place we're starting from, it did increase coverage to about 20 million people. There are still about 32 million uninsured and 44 million what are called underinsured. And underinsured people are people who have partial coverage, but the copays or the conditions that are not covered put extreme fiscal financial stress on them. And so if you look at this chart, you can see that the number of uninsured actually came down not insignificantly as a result of the Obama law. And it should also be said that that Obama was the fifth president, the fifth administration since the war to have tried to do universal health care. So many administrations had tried before, and the only success had been the partial creation of Medicare in 1965. So it was not an insubstantial achievement. But the way in which it was enacted tells you a lot about the pathologies of the American political system. And that's what I want to focus the rest of our time on. So if you think about Obama coming into office in January of 2009, and this is one of the top issues on the agenda after Dodd-Frank, this is the #1 issue, much to the chagrin of environmentalists who wanted environmental stuff to be the #2 issue. But Obama decided universal health care. He had campaigned on it, and he wanted to do it. And so one issue that was central to trying to get this done was controlling costs. Now, medical costs are high for two reasons in America. If you plot the rate of inflation against the rate of medical inflation in the US, what you find is that the rate of medical inflation is sometimes 3 and often at least 2 times as the rate of regular inflation. So medical costs are going up faster than the rate of inflation. You might say, well, why is that? So one reason is the lack of universal coverage itself, because what it means is that people without coverage essentially use emergency room care for their basic medical provisions. And that's about the most expensive possible way to give people health care, because the overhead involved in running an emergency room is enormous. And so that then hospitals tend to pass on those costs to everybody else in the form of higher prices. So that's a big part of the reason that medical inflation is so high. And then a second piece of it is that the cost of drugs to the federal government is extremely expensive, because when Medicare Part D was created by the George W. Bush administration in the early part of the century, this was free prescription drug benefits for seniors, people on Medicare. They forewent the opportunity to negotiate drug prices for the federal government directly with the drug companies. If the federal government's going to be this big purchaser, they obviously have a lot of leverage in price negotiations. But they forewent that opportunity, and you can see in the early years when the Medicare Part D was going through, you can see big increases in lobbying as that bill was going through Congress to stop the proposal that the Democrats were pushing at the time, and even many Republicans, to negotiate drug prices with the pharmaceutical companies. And so when Obama came in 2009, everybody who had studied the problem, all the health policy experts said, you have to deal with the cost question first, because if you're going to expand coverage before you deal with the cost question, then what's going to happen is the sticker shock of this for the American voter is going to be out of sight, and you're going to make the whole program vulnerable. So that would mean taking on big pharma, because as you can see, as the Obama legislation was going through Congress, the lobbying also skyrocketed because they were extremely concerned about this issue. Obama had run on it in the campaign, and he was determined to address it. So that's big pharma. But then the other problem they had was that if you create universal coverage, particularly if you do it by including what was called a public option, which meant that for people who couldn't find private insurance, they would be able to buy medical insurance from the government. If they included in a public option, there were seen as several advantages to this. One was it would make sure that everybody would have the possibility of buying insurance, even in communities where there was no other insurers. Secondly, it would force competition into the system, particularly in areas where there was only one private insurer. They would now have to compete with the government, with the public option. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, from this perspective of thinking about the pathologies of path dependency in the American system, it would be a path to eventually creating Medicare for all, because more and more people could gradually move into the public option over time if it was providing better coverage. And so it would at least create the possibility of expanding the American system into something more recognizably like what we see in other countries. But adding the public option meant that not only would you have to take on big pharma, you would also have to take on the insurance industries. Big pharma or drugs, insurance, a different part of the healthcare industry, because for all the reasons I've just given, they didn't want a public option, right? And so the big debate in the administration, if you read the pop books on the first years of the Obama administration, is so how to square this problem, because if you don't solve the cost problem and you expand the coverage, you're going to get the sticker shock. But if you try to do both of these, you've got to take on two of the most effective lobbying groups in America. And as the lobbying went on, it became clear that, or it became believed in the White House, I don't know if it was clear or not, but it became believed that they couldn't fight both of these battles at once. And so, against the advice of the polity wonks, Obama punted on the drug controls, essentially gave up on the public option in return for some window dressing, apparent cost savings that, as we describe in our book, and I won't go through in detail, were largely chimerical. And so effectively they gave up and abandoned the idea to negotiate drug prices in order to get the big pharma off the back of the administration. And the thought was it's more important at the end of the day to increase coverage than it is to fight this battle on two fronts, which we're probably going to lose. And so that took Big Pharma out of the picture, and actually they started to support the bill. But the universal coverage problem was a much more difficult one. And here you can see, as Obama is still pressing to try and get the public option adopted. You can hear him making the case.
An additional step we can take to keep insurance companies honest is by making a not-for-profit public option available in the insurance exchange. Let me be clear. Let me be clear. It would only be an option for those who don't have insurance. No one would be forced to choose it. And it would not impact those of you who already have insurance. In fact, based on Congressional Budget Office estimates, we believe that less than 5% of Americans would sign up. Despite all this, the insurance companies and their allies don't like this idea. They argue that these private companies can't fairly compete with the government. And they'd be right if taxpayers were subsidizing this public insurance option. But they won't be. I've insisted that, like any private insurance company, the public insurance option would have to be self-sufficient and rely on the premiums it collects. But by avoiding some of the overhead that gets eaten up at private companies by profits, and excessive administrative costs, and executive salaries, it could provide a good deal for consumers. It would also keep pressure on private insurers to keep their policies affordable and treat their customers better. It is only one part of my plan and shouldn't be used as a handy excuse for the usual Washington ideological battles. But I will not back down on the basic principle that if Americans can't find affordable coverage, we will provide you with a choice.
So the reason there was all that applause from the Democrats in the House was that the previous month he had been getting cold feet about the public option, and in fact had made a couple of speeches saying that the public option was not essential to the bill, and he wasn't going to fight to the death to keep it. And this had produced big backlash on the left of the party, and so he came out there and made a strong speech in favor of keeping the public option in the bill, and seemed to be suggesting that it was non-negotiable. But the insurance industry had smelled blood in the water by then, and were going to work to try and get rid of the public option. And here again we run into some of the pathologies of the American system. As you all now know, you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass a bill. unless it's budget reconciliation, when you only need 50 votes, as we talked about in the class on taxes. So you needed 60 votes. And they had 59 votes for a long time, and finally when Al Franken's recount was resolved and he got his seat, they were up to 60 votes, but the 60th vote was from Connecticut Senator Joseph Lieberman, and he had indicated support for the legislation all along. But Connecticut is one of the insurance capitals of America, and so you can see here, you can get some sense of how this was going to play out.
With us now, Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut. You just heard the White House top advisor on such things saying that it is likely that both the House and Senate will finally come up with some kind of a health care bill that has some sort of public option in it. What's your take?
I hope not. In other words, I'm all for health care reform. We have a system that needs fixing, but we've got some more urgent problems than that. And the first, most urgent, is to fix our economy, to get it creating jobs again. And I think that a public option will actually hurt the economic recovery and our long-term fiscal situation, because it will end up causing the government to raise taxes, will probably raise premiums, or it will put us further into debt. I want to be able to say yes. There's so many good things we can do to make health insurance more affordable and to extend it to people who don't have it now. But I feel so strongly about the creation of another government health insurance entitlement, the government going into the health insurance business. I think it's such a mistake that I would use the power I have as a single senator to stop a final vote.
But wouldn't that mean that you might wind up with nothing instead of something?
Well, the truth is that nothing is better than that, because I think we ought to follow, if I may, the doctor's oath here in Congress as we deal with health care reform. Do no harm.
I'm going to ask you this question because I want to give you a chance to respond to it.
Okay.
Some of your critics say that the reason that you are so dead set against the public option is because there are so many insurance companies headquartered in your home state in Connecticut, and they've been some of your biggest supporters. What have they given you this year? $400,000, something like that? Does that have anything to do with your position on the public option?
No. I wish people would come out and debate me on the public option instead of questioning my motives. That's not the reason, but I will say this. This recommendation of a public option, a government health insurance company, takes our government down a road that we've never gone down before. In other words, we believe in a market economy. It's what's created the great American middle class, but it doesn't have a conscience. When it behaves badly, we regulate it, companies, we sue them. I've been angry at oil companies. I never had the idea that the government should go into the oil business to make oil companies behave better. I think this would be a terrible mistake.
So, as you could see, that is Lieberman making his case as to why he's opposed to the public option. Of course, oil markets are completely unlike health insurance markets, because they're not subject to the problems of adverse selection that we discussed earlier, where the people who if you don't have a universal system, the people that most need the insurance are going to be the ones that the company's going to least want to insure. And so it's not a very convincing argument. However, it was a political winner. And 10 days before the bill was going to go through the Senate, he was the 60th vote, and he insisted that unless the public option was taken out of the bill, he would not vote for it. And so it was taken out of the bill. And so having made the decision not to take on Big Pharma over prices because of the difficulty of fighting two wars at the same time, they didn't in the end get the universal coverage either. And so you can see the pathologies of the American system playing themselves out with this. What happened subsequently with Obamacare? Well, it was challenged in the courts and finally made its way to the Supreme Court, and many people thought that the court was going to strike down the entire bill, particularly because of some drafting errors in provisions about the individual mandate. And there were two surprises in the Supreme Court's decision written by John Roberts in NFIB. I should say then NFIB is the National Federation of Independent Businesses. They tend to represent small business rather than big business, and they're very conservative and very opposed to healthcare insurance. And so they brought this case. And so Roberts, and this was the surprise that gets a lot of press, said, well, actually the individual mandate, which requires you to have insurance, so to get around the problem of adverse selection or pay a penalty, that penalty was a tax. And so it was the taxing power of the federal government saved Obamacare. But a different feature, and another surprise, that's a great surprise to everybody in the health care industry and people who study this, was that there had been another provision in the Obama bill to try and move it toward more universal coverage with respect to Medicaid coverage for poor people, which is that they gave a lot of funds to expand Medicaid in the states, to improve it, to get away from the niggardly system of block grants that had diminished Medicaid funding over such a long period of time. And what they did, for almost all of the money for this was coming from the federal government, so states would not have to raise taxes. But they also conditioned all their Medicaid funding, all of the federal government's Medicaid funding, on signing up for this. And of course, many of the states had conservative Republican legislatures or governors who didn't want to expand Medicaid. And so they were arguing that this was an unfair coercion, and the court bought this argument. And so this, in effect, while it saved part of Obamacare and saved the individual mandate, it made it impossible for the federal government to force the states to even condition federal aid to the states on their expansion of Medicaid. And so that greatly reduced the reach and reduced the expansion of coverage that Obamacare would have provided to poor people. And playing out the path dependency in 2017, when the Trump administration comes into office, because the individual mandate has now been declared to be a tax, they could repeal it as part of the 27 tax law, for which they only needed 50 votes because it was going through as part of the budget reconciliation, so which they duly did. And so the individual mandate was taken out of the bill, and that, of course, is the stopgap against the unraveling of insurance markets in the face of the adverse selection problem. And they've also damaged it in other ways that are being fought out in the courts by allowing consortiums of small businesses to club together to buy insurance, which would again enable better heeled groups to bail out of the system and leaving less well-heeled groups in it. Again, another version of the Hirschman problem. So what might be done? So one argument that we propose in The Wolf at the Door is to think of bottom-up Medicare expansion. And the idea here is the following, that currently most people can cover their children up to age 26 on their health insurance. This is through existing regulation. If you said that people in year one from age 26 to 30 could buy Medicare, this would be quite cheap because it's not young people who get sick, it's old people who get sick, right? And so you could move towards Medicare for all step by step. But if you started with the younger people and then they could keep it as they grew older, it would take a generation to achieve that gain. But eventually, you would be getting there. And it secondly takes account one of the problems, one of the things that all of the Democratic candidates are running into or certainly the ones on the left of the party, is that most people, it said over and over again, 180 million people have health insurance from their employers and they're satisfied with it. But two things are happening over time. One is they're getting less satisfied with it because the cost to employers are going up, and so they're getting less and less generous plans, or they're like, just as at Yale now you can get the health plan or you can get Aetna and then you can get a more expensive Aetna, and they're creating tiered systems. But more and more people are finding that the coverage they're getting from their employers isn't that great. And then secondly, think about what we've talked about over the course of the last few weeks. More and more people are going to be losing their jobs over and over again over the course of their careers. So even if they have employer-based health care, they're probably not going to be able to keep it. And every time they change jobs, the question is going to be, well, what kind of health benefits come? And so many of those people who might today not think there's anything wrong with their health insurance that the government should be fixing, might start to have a very different view over time, given the fiscal pressures on firms to reduce these costs and the fact that people are going to be changing employment and might have to go from a job that has coverage to a job that hasn't got coverage, or at least might have no coverage while they're looking for another job. And so even though current polling suggests most people are satisfied with their employer-based policies, that number is likely to change. And if you had a way of voluntarily buying into Medicare, the group for that would grow. And then, of course, this builds the political coalition over time because you have more and more people in the coalition who want to be able to keep what they're getting. And so this is the kind of policy that we argue can work its way through our building blocks of distributive politics and actually become a credible a viable political path to a serviceable policy. And so as I say, we didn't have much of a positive thing to say about K through 12 education, but this is a kind of path forward which wouldn't have the sort of sticker shock that Medicare for All has today. And if you think about it as a 10 or 15 year project, actually has a chance of viability as a proposal for which support can be built. Okay, we will talk about proposals for political reform in the final lecture on Thursday.